And David, just to confirm before we get going, is it you or CBI on notes today?
I can take notes. Yeah, happily.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
So here is your agenda for the day. And I'm happy to walk through this, and then Jared and Colin, please chime in. The big items on this, or the items on this, one is I've heard from some of you that there's interest in providing some questions to the work that's happening with a variety of community engagement and outreach efforts that are happening. And so there's a space to talk about that. How you all, from a science and data perspective, may have some questions or sort of thoughts that you want to help shape that community engagement team's work. The second piece is social cost of social cost of greenhouse gases. I seem to have changed the terminology there on me. And there, the idea is to confirm what you want to propose up to the council and have the council adopt in its usual sort of two-step process starting July 8th. So just walk through that. Jared, Breck will walk you through that. There is time for public comment after that. You can see that as well as at the end of the meeting. And then the two other things after the public comment, one is Colin's going to walk through some changes to the inventory methodology. And so Colin will do that. And then there's a quick update around how you all want to be liaisons in other subcommittees or vice versa. So there's an update to that. That's it. That's what I have. Jared or Colin, help correct or amplify. Is that good?
Sounds great.
And everybody else on the subcommittee, does that sound good? Any questions about today's work? All good? Thanks, Breck. Okay, let's do it. So what I don't see on this agenda, do you all like approve notes and things like that, or that not a thing for you all?
We do. I was not able to get to putting together the notes, the recording of the last meeting yet, so apologies, but we're gonna have to wait and do that at the next meeting.
Okay, no worries. Okay. So this discussion on the engagement, I'm happy to answer questions on it because it's actually my team that's out there doing that in Vermont, doing all the interesting stuff and engaging with lots of different folks. So if folks have questions about what's actually happening, I'd be happy to answer those. But fundamentally, this is a space for you all to say, if there's folks out there talking to a diverse range of Vermonters, from our perspective and the work we're trying to do in science and data, these are the kinds of things we would encourage them to include in their sort of list of, and again, short list of questions. Jared, did you want to say anything else about that, or Colin?
I mean, maybe David, and you please add to this, but just for context, I think many people on this subcommittee are aware, but just in case not, there were two public engagement events that were held as part of the kickoff to the update process of the climate action plan, working backwards from our July 1st, 2025 due date of an updated climate action plan. And David facilitated a number of climate counselors joined, many members of the public. I was on the session that happened yesterday, and I think there were over 90 people. But I know that in addition to these kind of broad online virtual options for engagement to provide feedback, there's also a lot of direct outreach to either specific communities or going to different places. And so, David, please add anything to the kind of breadth and timeline there, but just so you have a sense of the scope of the community engagement that is being undertaken, over the next year as part of our CAP update process. I think that's some important context.
Yeah, Breck, let me go to your hand and then I'll describe what I just put in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, David. I'm a relatively new member to the committee here, subcommittee here, and could you just two questions about these questions. One is kind of what is the kind of the target level of understanding of the audience that we are posing this question to. So let me just give an example. So is it at the level of a question in which you would say, to what degree do you think that climate change is real? You know, is that the level of question? Or is it at a more nuanced level of saying, how is it that what's the most effective way for you to receive information about the scientific basis for climate change and the scientific basis for the way that greenhouse gases are being accounted for? Maybe I'll just leave it at that question. What audience are we seeking questions from?
Yeah, I love the question, and I'm interested to hear what Leslie Ann has to say about it, because I saw your hand go up.
I thought you'd do that, David. And I think that's what sort of came out yesterday, Breck, in terms of the pitch. And what was really, really clear to me, I didn't say anything yesterday, David, but I wanted to sort of like swing back around to that, because I think there's almost a somewhat of a disconnect between a lot of the work that we do, a lot of the conversations that we have, and the distilling of that to the folks that we're trying to reach. And so there were a lot of comments yesterday about maybe if we use different mechanisms like infographics or more easy to understand and digest mechanisms, that would have a different place for starting off the conversation. I think it's really important for us as scientists, as data users, to actually hear that and appreciate that now at the beginning of the conversation, because it would help set us up in a better place for actually doing these engagements, as opposed to maybe talking at a little bit. And to the extent that we take stock right now and really and honestly have a conversation about that in terms of how do we do that better. The other thing, since I have the floor, the other thing that I wanted to sort of raise is because we had the 3 subcommittees that are in statute listed on there, we started getting questions. So where's science and data? Where's just transitions? And it sort of goes back to a comment that I've been making throughout this whole process, that if we don't always talk about all 5 committees at the same time, it sort of reinforces this us and them, this sort of two-tiered system. And so to the extent that as we move forward with engagement, that we have all of the subcommittees represented, so that folks don't say, but where's all the science in all this? Where's all of the additional data pieces that we need to have at play in play? So hopefully answers some of your questions, Breck, because it was something that really, really came out yesterday afternoon.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's that latter question. It's the more elevated question, and that's good.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I appreciate the reflection as well, Leslie Ann. You know, there is an appetite to receive information in different ways, right? And not have it be the way that, you know, different people are going to understand different things. You know, the level of conversation we've been having, if you click through that link I put in the chat just quickly, and we don't need to spend a ton of time on this, but if you click through that, you'll see we've been doing these, or the engagement team has been doing like quarterly roundups of the activities we've been doing and what we're hearing in those activities. In the first 3 months of this year, we're very focused on doing some small group conversations with people who are really not engaged kind of at all in these kinds of policy processes, like what we're doing with updating the climate action plan. We did a big focus on people with diverse language realities. And so what we do with that is we go in and we have some pretty, you know, open-ended conversations about how do you understand what's happening around you, right? From a climate perspective, right? How do you see, you know, and then we try to talk about the way people get to work or the way people heat their homes and that kind of stuff, right? So we get into those kinds of conversations and how the state's involved. And then and oftentimes in these kinds of conversations, there's a lot about, well, what is the state doing? Like, what are the programs? How do we get in, like, how do we access these programs kind of thing? So that's what we're typically doing in those conversations. And I like, Breck, the way you framed it of, and that's always the last question in these types of small group conversations and others, which is what is the most effective way to have this conversation, both in terms of providing information, engaging effectively. What I'm hearing from you, Breck, is, you know, the questions are really about like, how do you get information? Like, how would you want information? Right? That kind of stuff.
Right.
Okay.
And if we could make it more of a conversation, a two-way street, circling back, feedback loop type of thing, I think it would play a little bit better, because we didn't have the time last time to do that, and now we're trying to do it better. And so, to the extent that we converse with, we have information sharing as opposed to only giving, would actually help us get to a different place. And would help to actually maybe have some pathways, solutions, strategies, ideas that we didn't even think about, by having an easy to access portal for all of these bits to sort of come in, be received, clarifying questions if need be, and then sort of keep that as an ongoing conversation as opposed to a one-time thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And just as a quick update on this, like when we go out and do something like this, our intent is to always find a pathway to circle back with those communities. And if we're attending events, like if the team attends events, we've been doing a lot of tabling and things like that. Our goal is then to be back the next year and table that event again, right? And show up again to have those kinds of more conversational approaches. All right, Jared?
Thanks, David. Yeah, I really agree with the comments that have just been made, including by Leslie, and around the how we communicate information and that back and forth. I wonder if there's also a potential avenue around the what information gets communicated or talked about. And I wonder if a helpful question in that regard is something like, what parts of the scientific conversation around climate, and I think we could break that down into, you know, causes, impacts, solutions, but what parts of that conversation are feel clear to you, and what feels unclear? Because that could help us identify what areas of conversation would benefit from greater information, greater clarity, trying to provide that, because there are some, you know, to what degree is there a lot of confusion about a certain subject out there? You know, there's some good information, there's some bad information. So I wonder if a question along those lines, what parts of the scientific conversation around climate, whether causes, impacts, or solutions, feel either clear or unclear to you? That might help give us some information about areas to focus on going forward.
Thanks, Jared. That's great. Claire?
Thanks. I definitely agree with Jared, and I think this comment is related, but I wonder if there's also I don't know if it's a question to the communities, or it's an analysis or a review of what comes up in these conversations. But it strikes me that as we like find out where the information gaps or confusions are, there's also a piece there about like what metrics, what data we're communicating, and how it's associated with metrics that we use to track and assess project progress. And I know we've had some of these like conversations of the role in public engagement and forming those types of things, I think, through some of the work, thinking about the measuring and assessing progress tool. But it feels like there's also something there with, as we have these conversations and we hear from people, there's an opportunity to assess, like, are there data streams that we don't have that would be useful in the way that we're communicating and or even the way that we're modeling strategies? And then also that what people would see as like an indicator of success and how we can build that into the work we're doing. Yeah.
Thanks, Claire. Okay. Brian?
Yeah, thanks, David. Just a brief observation for me from the participation, or that I'm observing what's going on in the public meetings, and they have been great, and we've gotten some great engagement. But like the way they unfold is like we provide this really good information. I think people are getting it. We ask what they think. And then a lot of times we're getting back, we want this thing or that thing. We want, more transit, or we want light rail, or, we want all this stuff, which is great stuff. And it's the feedback that we want, but it's not aligned with the reduction targets that we're trying to achieve. And I think that's really where the disconnect is. And I'm a little concerned that because, we take in that comment, don't respond to it because it's not the place to do that, that we're creating this expectation that like, oh yeah, this stuff might happen, or it's really under consideration because it's cost effective, it advances us towards our reduction targets, all those things. When I think this group and cross sector and the council as a whole understands that in a lot of cases, that's not really what's happening. And I think the materials are good, and I think the messaging is good, and we're eliciting the comment that we want. And to me, it's that last part, that kind of disconnect between what people are saying they want and what needs to happen in order to be able to get on these reduction goals aren't the same thing.
Right. It's like the next layer of conversation, right? Of inviting them in to do that analysis with us. Yeah. Okay. I think I want to be conscious of time because we're pretty much out. I want to, again, it's really helpful to have all this feedback. If you have sort of specific things you want to make sure that the engagement team is working on, let us know. Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, from the experience so far, can you identify the most pernicious misinformation that is floating about, that is confusing people or bothering people? I mean, if you were going to shape a communication strategy, it might be helpful to know what that most pernicious misinformation is.
I'd be, Claire's been out doing a lot of engagement too, last year. I'd hate to venture forth there. I think there's a lot of thoughts around the transportation sector. I think this may be where that previous comment, Brian's comment, was going to, where there's not a clear understanding of the actual potential pathways that allow the emissions reduction in the transportation sector. And there's a lot of kind of anger around EVs among some people and things like that. And a lot of hope placed on reducing vehicle miles traveled and things like that. So that's one thing. But there's so much disinformation. I do a lot on offshore wind, and oh my God. But that's a whole, Richard, I think it's a great point. Maybe it's something that if you all, in all of your enormous amounts of spare time, which I'm sure you don't have, if you were to go through and read through like the quarterly reports, and I can send you a link where you can find them, and you look through, you're like, wow, that's wild. That might be a way to do it.
Okay. Onwards.
Claire, last word on this?
Yeah, I'll be brief because I actually want to respond to Brian's comment, and well, it's a little bit related to Richard's. I think public engagement, and at least in our experience with the REDS, it certainly highlights where there is a need for more clear communication and information, and where I think maybe as the experts, or think we're the experts, think we like understand. But I also want to, so that's important. Like that tells us where we can be more effective communicators. But I also think if we've done the work to communicate effectively and there's still a disconnect, I wonder if it's also showing where some of the strategies are not aligning with the values or priorities or needs of the communities that are being engaged with. And that I think is equally important information to Leslie Ann's point about like what alternative solutions might then be better placed to fit with both those needs and priorities and values, and also effective climate mitigation. So I think there's kind of two pieces to that disconnect.
Okay. So I wrote down some notes, and my general practice is to share those And since I'm typing in real time, it's a little tricky. So I don't actually have the last point well written, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to say, this is what I wrote down. One sec. So these are my notes, and what I took away in terms of input from you all is focus on high-level questions, how we communicate information, what information. I have this very specific question about that Jared put out there as part of that. Then I wrote down what we heard yesterday and this week was there's an appetite for different ways to receive information, and that's helpful in terms of how this happens. And then I heard, ask about what people would consider success in terms of achieving climate goals, and also data sets that could be helpful that maybe we're not aware of in the measuring and assessing progress tool. And then this final point of the two pieces of disconnect, a little bit what Richard said, and then Claire, of like, where is there clear misinformation or, misunderstanding? And then also, how do we understand in the way that which strategy being put forward, they're not really aligned with communities' core interests and needs. So I haven't written that part yet, but that's what goes into that. Did I miss something key from what we just talked about? Okay, let's move on then. Thanks. The next piece on your agenda is Jared was going to, and Breck were going to present on the social costs of greenhouse gases. Wait, you're on mute.
Yes, thank you, David. So I think the way I had started putting together slides for this, but I think it's actually a short enough draft of that it's worth it just to read through it together and take it piece by piece to make sure that we understand the background, the update, and the draft recommendation. So let me just set some context before we dive in on this. And then David, if you want to, are you able to share screen, or should I
With
the draft recommendation document?
Oh, that's in the calendar invite?
Yeah, it's on the
I can do that. Yeah, give me one second.
materials. Thanks.
Yeah, one second.
So as folks will remember, at our last Science and Data Subcommittee meeting, we had a presentation from Dr. Elizabeth Koppitz from the Environmental Protection Agency, presenting on the report that they issued in November on updated estimates of the social cost of greenhouse gases following the process that the federal government went through responding to the recommendations of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And so we got that presentation. It came into a context of we had already identified in the initial climate action plan that this is a number that there is new scientific advances occurring each year. We knew this federal review process was underway and that it's appropriate to review and update these estimates from time to time as the science improves. And so Breck and Colin and I volunteered as a task group to take the information that we received from Dr. Koppitz and the EPA report, looking at the context of the recommendation that this subcommittee made and that the Climate Council adopted back in 2021, and put together a memo that summarized that background, provided the update, and then drafted a new recommendation for updated estimates of the social cost of greenhouse gases that as a task group, we wanted to put before you for consideration in terms of the recommendation of what would get included in the update to the climate action plan as part of the scientific underpinning and how we do benefit cost analysis. So that's that background. David, do you have that ready to?
Yep. I was just waiting for the.
Thank you. Perfect. So in the background, we just pasted the recommendation that was in the initial climate action plan that was adopted. in 2021. And that included that greenhouse gas emissions costs and avoided costs should be valued by utilizing a global damage-based estimation of the social cost of carbon. That's the approach that most state and federal governments that do this utilize, and we adopted the approach that New York had utilized based on work they had done and numbers that they had published. That was what was available at the time. The EPA process, the interagency working group update that had been recommended by the national academies was still underway. So we had to use an interim value. We used those New York values. So that was recommendation number 1 back in 2021. The second was around what discount rate to use, because there's this key issue of how costs and savings that occur in the future are valued in the present, and questions of intergenerational equity and how much in the difference in the time spans of those. So the recommendation at that point was to utilize the central discount rate of 2% in calculating the social cost of carbon, while also having a range presented from 1 to 3% for context. And then the last recommendation was that we plan to update the social cost of carbon and the discount rate, or review it on a regular basis, taking into account new research. So that's what the initial recommendation was in brief summary. And then if we go down to the update section, one piece of context that's relevant to know is that initial set of values for the social cost of carbon was utilized by the Agency of Natural Resources in 2022 as part of the economic analysis that was associated with the rulemaking effort around Advanced Clean Cars 2, Advanced Clean Trucks, and the heavy duty omnibus and associated rules. That's a long title.
All right.
But technically correct title.
Here, Jared, just in the interest of time, I want to do like the express version through this. So do you want to sort of cut to the chase of like what the recommendation is?
Yep.
Sorry, it's Friday. Keep going.
So, we got the presentation on the new report from the EPA. A key paragraph from that executive summary we provided in full here.
Yeah. Okay.
And then we go to the draft recommendation.
Yeah.
And so it's very straightforward. No surprises. That we should utilize the EPA's updated social cost of greenhouse gas estimates as included in their report for benefit cost analysis of activities that impact greenhouse gas emissions and any greenhouse gas emissions related rules. Then there's the question around the discount rate. That report from the EPA presented ranges from 1.5% to 2.5%. And they presented 2% as the central discount rate, consistent with the original recommendation. The task group suggests that we stay with that, both because that's the central discount rate in the EPA report, and because it is what has been recommended by a leading panel of economists that studied this, and that link is provided below. And then we have a recommendation that, similar to what we did in 2021, that this is a topic that should be returned to as the science continues to advance. We know in particular that there is a requirement at the federal level, there's a recommendation at the federal level that the social cost of greenhouse gases be updated every 5 years. And so if we look ahead to the next climate action plan, which will be due in July of 2029, we wanted to include for posterity in this recommendation that we will, at the very least, want to be looking at any updates that have been made before then that we should consider mirroring. So that's the recommendation in summary. And Breck, please.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, David.
I was just saying what's not, specified in the document here are the actual, is the actual number, right? And that actual number is a significant change from what the New York number was when the last time, right?
Hard to pick a specific number because it's the marginal cost of a ton emitted in a certain year. So there's a different social cost of greenhouse gases depending on the year and depending on the greenhouse gas. So that's another distinction that's worth mentioning, is that these aren't, the EPA didn't just develop social costs for a metric ton of carbon dioxide. It was also for methane and for nitrous oxide. So there's a whole schedule. So that's why it didn't make sense to put one number. But just for reference, for an example related to what you were saying, David, the social cost of carbon that was estimated, if it was emitted in the year 2020, in the New York study was $121 a ton. With the federal EPA updates, a ton of carbon dioxide emitted in 2020, the estimate would be $190 a ton. So about a 58% increase in the estimated social cost of that greenhouse gas in that year. And the other gases in other years are somewhat similar.
Thanks, Jared. That's super helpful. Richard?
I would like to suggest that Jared's last paragraph, spoken paragraph, be incorporated in the document.
So people get a sense of the implications of what we're saying.
Yeah, making clear it's an example, and it wouldn't be exactly the same for other years and other gases.
Nice. How do other folks feel about that? Any concerns about it? Claire gives a thumbs up. Any concerns about adding essentially a written version of what Jared just did, of saying, hey, it's a table, there's a lot of variables, but if you use an example, blah, 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 it would do this.
And we could link directly to that table or paste it in.
Okay.
We did that in the first cap.
Yeah. Thanks, Madison. Okay. All right. So add in a sentence that gives that sense of change with illustrative example. Okay. So this is an opportunity if folks have questions. Essentially what happens next, if you all are okay with this, is you push it up to the council and say, council, please take it on. Before you do that, anything else like Richard's suggestion of things that you'd really want to see in the way this is presented?
And I wanted to pause to see if Breck, there was anything that you wanted to add to the overview or specific kind of emphasis that you thought was worth providing.
Jared, I thought you gave a great summary. I know time is limited here. I'll just add two very quick comments that in point 2, the idea behind emphasizing the 2% or a single rate was to avoid a kind of choose your own adventure sort of situation when people are actually trying to apply these concepts to a rule or a law. And finally, that last sentence about in point 3, that we should continue to have all of this based on the best available science is just a subtle message.
Thanks, Brad. Okay. Any other discussion you all would like to have before you sort of more formally send this up to the council? Anything else needs to be said? Okay. Any concerns with sending this up to the council with the change that Richard just suggested? Any concerns with that? Okay. So with that, let's say that this is good to go with that change. We'll add that sentence in. Excellent. Thanks, everyone. Important. All right. Next on our agenda, we were going to pause here for public comment, if I remember correctly. We're a little ahead of schedule, but we might as well pause. So if anybody's joining our call, I don't have the member list in front of me right now, so I'm just treating everybody as a member. But if anyone's joining our call today that isn't a member of the Science and Data Subcommittee and has something to say about these topics, feel free to jump in now or raise your hand. Okay, great. Okay. All right, so the next thing is Colin giving us this walkthrough of some changes in methodologies. So Colin, take it away.
All right, thank you. I did put together just a few slides on this, so let me just pull those up now. Find the share button here. There we go. Sorry, 1 second. Too many things open here.
I'm just taking my notes as we go, so it's helpful for me.
Okay, can you all see that?
Yeah, it's not in presenter mode just yet.
Yeah, let me see.
There you
How
go.
about that?
Perfect.
Better?
Yep.
All right, great. Okay, so yeah, I'm just gonna plan to run through, I guess to start off with, I'm currently in the process of trying to make some of these changes in short order. So just kind of wanted to, run them all by you and get any thoughts and make sure that kind of what I'm proposing makes sense. There aren't too many kind of say large scale or real substantive changes here, but I have 3 of them at least to kind of talk through with you anyway. So I'm going to start off, and I think a lot of you have seen kind of presentations on this by me before, but just to set kind of a little bit of context, just a little bit of background on what the inventory is. So it's kind of the annual, say, snapshot of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions from Vermont. We publish it annually from the Agency of Natural Resources. And the inventory is kind of, it's officially the gross total emissions by sector, but it does include a land use sector that does have that kind of net sequestration component to it. And so it is all included in the inventory, but in terms of like the Global Warming Solutions Act requirements, it has been determined that is the gross components of those that are the targets. And so it's kind of done by economic sector, but there are other ways you could break it out. This is kind of just the framework that is really standardized and kind of used by a lot of people that use kind of the EPA tools that the inventory relies in large part on. Which gets to my next bullet. It does rely on a number of, and that number is, it's gradually decreasing, but a number of EPA kind of tools and data sets especially, and data sets not just from EPA, but from a lot of other federal agencies, federal agriculture especially, but others as well. And so there is a lag time associated with that, and all the kind of preparation of that data and those tools that incorporate it. So the inventory, you see below, kind of covers the standard suite of gases. I won't list them all off for you, but they're right there. And it's consistent with the methodologies are consistent with kind of the IPCC guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventories. And it's kind of based on the statute compatible with the 1990 to 2030 reference case projections study down there. That was kind of the first inventory done for the state. So I guess one other point here that will tie into one of the changes I'm proposing to make is that in the previous inventories, the inventory used the global warming potentials from the IPCC AR4 report, because that was kind of the standard guidance at the time. It has now been changed and we'll be using the AR5 guidance, which has different kind of global warming potential multipliers for the gases other than carbon dioxide. So there's a lot more that could be said there, but that at least is a little overview of kind of what the inventory is. And if anybody does have questions as I'm going through this, please just feel free to stop me. So again, just a little more background, but these are just the sectors that are included in the inventory: transportation, mobile sources, residential, commercial, industrial fuel use, or what people refer to as the thermal sector, kind of buildings, thermal fuel use, the agricultural sector, industrial processes, waste and wastewater, electricity generation, fossil fuel industry, which sounds really large, but is actually in this case essentially just the leakage of natural gas from transmission and distribution lines. And then the land use change and forestry sector, or LULUCF as we lovingly call it. So I'm just going to jump right into these, and then if I give some time to kind of discuss or have questions for them specifically, so I'll just kind of pause after each one. But the three kind of more major updates are the incorporation of kind of a new to us data set from the tax department that is related to fuel volumes. And so I'll go into the details of that in a minute, but the second one is a change in the methodology and kind of data source as well for the emissions from ozone depleting substances substitutes. Favorite tongue twister there. And then an update on the methodology for the solid waste subsector to kind of more accurately incorporate the emissions from closed landfills in the state. So let me jump into the first one here, because it's probably the most to talk about. So this kind of use of tax department data for fuel volumes is going to be, I think, the most kind of, let's say, drastic change. It's not, I think, going to change the emissions that much, although I haven't kind of come up with the final numbers quite yet. But the idea is that we have this data reported to the tax department yes, it's the fuel tax data, and so you can derive the fuel volumes from that tax data. And so the data has come in a few different forms, but the 2017 to 2023, and Jared, if you want to jump in on this, I know you've also looked pretty extensively at this data, so please feel free. But the 2017 to 23 has essentially lumped together heating oil, kerosene, propane, and other dyed diesel. And so that data is available, and it's kind of partially available back to 2015. There is a little bit of kind of just subtraction involved from two different pots of funding to pull out the propane, but that's pretty easy to do. And then kind of the additional piece from that is that based on a change to this tax form that I list, FGR 615, which is where this all comes from, the petroleum distributor licensing fee. In the lab, we have about 9 months spanning 2023 and 2024 that kind of disaggregate that data out of that kind of one, say, bucket and into the different components. And so you're able to get a better picture of kind of where yeah, of how much of each of those fuels are in the overall total. And so the problem with that, and I maybe should have mentioned this up front for the inventory, but is that the inventory every year kind of recalculations all the way back to 1990. And so just using kind of a new data set or new methodology for a current or even a handful of current years doesn't really work if you can't accurately project it backwards, and or at least reasonably accurately project it backwards. And that's really because of the targets or the requirements, because the requirements are based on 2005 and 1990. And so if you don't make the same changes in those kind of baseline years, you're going to end up kind of comparing two things that aren't directly comparable. So anyway, the plan with that data, kind of what I've been working on, is to take that 9 months of the kind of more granularly disaggregated data, and I first kind of extend that to the full year by taking months, because not all the fuel kind of percentages are the same for each month. As you can imagine, heating fuel is a lot higher percentage, higher totals in the winter months than in the summer months. And so kind of my first exercise was to try to match kind of the missing months with something that would likely be a corresponding month. So like fall, I would match with a spring kind of a total. And there, I'm sure are some issues with that, but that's kind of the best that I was able to come up with for the moment until we have a full year's worth of data. So then the idea was to kind of take those totals and using those percent kind of say contributions of the fuel totals to project those backwards. And really the important part of that, because we have been able to pull out propane, and I'm sorry I'm getting into the weeds here, but hopefully it's not too much. But the important part really out of this in terms of kind of where we put the different emissions in the different sectors is the other dyed diesel. And if you don't really kind of care which sector the emissions go in, it's not as critical. But the plan for this inventory is to try to take out that other dyed diesel component, which is kind of the off-road, like construction equipment, logging equipment that has previously, because of how the former federal data set was structured, been included in the RCI sector industrial category, and move that into the non-road component of the transportation sector. And so that, I think, is going to be kind of the biggest, say, switch from this data set use. And so, Richard, I see your hand. Let me just finish one more thing, and that is that the other issue that I kind of alluded to is that you also have to then make the assumption that that kind of percentage of the total that is other dyed diesel is the same all the way back to 1990, which is not probably correct, but is the best that I can come up with for a way to do that. So let me pause there and take Richard's question.
I'm really glad to see this, Colin, and I'm somebody who enjoys going down these rabbit holes with you. So
Great.
I appreciate the level of detail. My question is whether in the process of updating their data collection, the tax department maybe possibly has made it easier to tell in what region of the state the fuel is used. I mean, up until now, we have the only regional data they could give us was where the distributor was located, which is not all that great. Is there any sign of progress on that front?
I was not really involved in making that change on the tax form, but I think that is not something that is a reality currently. I don't like, all I get is very, is totally, it's a statewide total. I don't even have it by county or any kind of region. It's just the fuels kind of disaggregated, but is a statewide total. So I don't know if that data exists. From the discussions I have heard with the tax department, I think they would be pretty leery of giving that out in any kind of a disaggregated form. They were, and I think kind of rightfully so, pretty protective of that. They want to kind of make sure that they maintain all their confidentiality things they need to. But I think the answer to your question is unfortunately no. I don't believe that's currently available, and not sure if it's possible or not. But
We
certainly
we
ask.
we have previously seen such data aggregate by location of the distributor.
Gotcha.
And what we'll do in order to make Addison County estimates is probably use the current population survey data on primary heating fuel, and say, Addison County homes that use fuel oil as their primary heating fuel are X% of the state total homes using fuel oil, and then apply that percentage to the total. It's not great, but it's what we can do.
Reasonable. Yeah. All right. Great. Thanks. Jared, go ahead.
Colin, did you get through the kind of summary of this methodology and data change that you wanted to, or?
More or less, yes.
Okay.
I guess the other part of this that I don't have to go into the details of is there's kind of a lot of going back and forth between aggregating and disaggregating just to make the tax data totals fit within the framework of the EPA calculation tool. So like trying to break out that tax data into residential, commercial, industrial, I have to use the SEDS, the State Energy Data System, federal data set percentages to do that because I don't have any other way to know that from the tax data. So I guess that was the only other part that I wanted to share, but.
Yeah, I just wanted to offer a couple pieces of feedback and then just highlight something that you said, Colin. Overall, I think that this is a really good step forward in terms of the accuracy and confidence of the inventory from the perspective of my understanding is that the data that has been used to date to estimate RCI emissions has been the state energy data set, the SEDS tool from EIA, which is, my understanding is at least partially based on survey data from fuel sellers. Whereas the data from the tax department is census type data. It is all the gallons sold have to be reported. And so to my mind as a data analyst, whenever there's a choice between census type data versus survey data, we'll almost always have more confidence in the accuracy and comprehensiveness of the census data. So I think this is a step forward and am very supportive of it. I recognize that it creates some kind of challenges and questions. And I think that there's actually kind of, and I just want to clarify this based on your bullet points. I think there's kind of two places that it leads to weighting and extrapolation being necessary, perhaps more. I mean, one is that if the tax data only goes back to 2017, is it your approach that you're going to look at the relationship from 2017 to 2023 of the tax data to the SEDS data, figure out that relationship, apply it back to 1990 overall, and then there's this question of dyed diesel, which to me is, I think the approach that you've presented is the best we can do given the data available, but I do think it'll be really important to return to once we get additional months of disaggregated data, because of applying a kind of the relative share of dyed diesel versus the other fuels back to 1990 based on 9 months of data. It'll be great to be able to have additional data to hopefully feel more confident that that's a the share, and that there's yeah. So, but overall, I think that this is a real step forward in terms of the quality and accuracy of the data on the RCI side. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Jared. And yes, I should have mentioned, but yes, I did do that as well. I kind of did take that kind of average percent difference between the tax data and the SEDS data for the corresponding years, and did adjust the SEDS. I had to first aggregate the SEDS and then adjust it and then disaggregate it again. But yes, I did do that. And yeah, agreed that it would be much nicer to have a full year's worth, and will be nice to have the data going forward to see if that kind of 20-ish% value maintains over years, or if it differs, and if it differs drastically, kind of what to do about that in projecting it backwards. But yeah.
And if it's okay, I would just underline something that you said, because I think it's an important takeaway from this in terms of people's expectations, is that regardless of where those dyed diesel emissions show up, whether it's in the RCI sector or in the transportation sector, it'll change the sectoral totals in 2021 and going back, but it's not going to change the overall statewide totals, because you have to account for them somewhere, and it's just which sector they're being accounted in that it sounds like may be changed.
Yeah, just shifting them. Yep. Great. Any other questions on that one, or shall I move on?
I'm just trying to keep up with you all, and I want to make sure I understand the key feedback that Colin needs to take from you all. Like, is there, like, between what Richard and Jared you just said, like, what does Colin need to take away from that in terms of anything that future work or immediate work on this fuel issue?
I mean, I'm happy to summarize mine, as I think that this is an improvement to the methodology based on a higher quality data set that is census-based rather than survey-based. And that it will be very important to continue to monitor the data on the dyed diesel, so that we get a larger span of time to extrapolate from.
Got it. Okay, thanks. And in terms of Richard's request, that, like, is it possible to look across the state, right, and get some geographic piece? Right.
Right.
Okay, great. Sorry, I don't want to slow you all down.
No, it's fine. Thanks. Breck, do you want to jump in here?
I just had a quick question about how often this data is updated. So you say you only have 9 months of data. How long will you have to wait to get the 3 more months of data? Is it 3 months, or is it a year, or?
I need to look back in an email to give you a definitive answer for that, but I believe it's either quarterly or every 6 months. But I think it might have been quarterly, so I think I can request it every 4 months or so.
So it might be problematic to wait to be able to get a full year's worth of data, to be able to have a whole year to be able to make your projections before you have to provide this inventory.
Right. Yeah, I said 4 months, 3 months, but yes, I think it will. I think it will be probably too long in coming. I got this data set within the last, well, I don't know, probably month and a half. So it might not be too far off. I could actually check that. That would be a good point. Maybe I will. Maybe I'll investigate that and then see. But yeah, thanks.
May I ask one other question?
Sure.
I put it in the chat, but I'm just curious: is the fuel tax rate the same, or is it different for different fuel types? And if it's different for different fuel types, that is included in the disaggregation computation to figure out the actual volume or mass of fuel that's being used?
Yes. So at least the petroleum licensing fee is the same, and I believe the fuel tax is the same as well, but that is why those were originally kind of all bundled into the same bucket. So the heating fuel, the other diesel, kerosene, and propane were all kind of either taxed or had the same distributor licensing fee associated. And so I think how they broke them out was they just changed the form to kind of request specifically kind of different line items for those different fuel categories. So yes, that has been accounted for anyway.
Great, thanks, Sean.
Sure.
Yeah, if folks are interested, I can just share really briefly what it looks like in the data set from the
Let's test if folks really are interested. I want to make sure there's the full subcommittee wants to do these deeper dives. So
I just want to clarify one thing that I think is really important is that the volumes aren't extrapolated based on the tax revenue. The volumes are directly reported by the tax department according to the form.
Okay.
And the reason that we can disaggregate propane is that the fuel tax applies to that, but not the petroleum distributor licensing fee.
Thanks, that's a great clarification.
nice.
Yes, thanks for clarifying, Jared. All right, shall I move on to the next one, or did you want to pull up that the workbook, Jared, or?
If it's, I can just share it with Breck if he's.
I think that's the plan. That's the plan.
Yeah.
The point's super clear. I'm glad you made the point, Jared. It's really helpful.
All right, sounds good. Well, if there are no other questions on that one, let me move on to the next, and we can always come back to that if people have different questions. Okay, so the next one is ozone depleting substitutes. And those are essentially mostly HFCs that were phased in to phase out ozone depleting substitutes. And then people realized they have a really high global warming potential. And so now they are in the process of being phased out as well. But anyway, just kind of some context to what those are. But how we had previously come up with an emissions total for those was that several years ago, as part of the U.S. Climate Alliance, in one of their HFC working group, California had put together a tool for kind of all the Climate Alliance states that essentially did this math and estimated this for them. And that was based on kind of California's, I don't remember what the actual model was called, but it was an HFC model that was very kind of a sophisticated model, but they boiled it down to kind of a per capita value. And so, excuse me, a per capita value that they then kind of built into this tool and allowed states to update or to kind of change the parameters kind of around either population or different kind of components that would impact, I guess, the amount of these gases that were either in your state or being emitted, like amount of houses with air conditioning units and heat pumps and your light duty vehicle fleet and things like that. And so that would kind of adjust the calculation that was based on the per capita value. And so they also had several different scenarios, and I won't go into the details of that, but essentially depending on what regulations your state had, and that was part of what this work group was working on, what regulations your state had, you kind of had different paths for which values you would choose. And so that was great and had more faith in that than kind of what was built into EPA's tools at the time. But that model, which California, I think, kind of put together as a one-off for the states, they're not planning to update it. And it was based on the AR4 global warming potentials, so the previous version, essentially. And given how the tool is put together, you can't get into it deeply enough to get to the specific gases to which you would apply a different global warming potential value. And so there's really no way, because it is a whole lot of different gases with different global warming potentials, there's no way to just update the whole thing with a different set of GWP values. And so kind of the plan now is to essentially just stop using the tool, unfortunately. But fortunately, EPA has also gained a lot of interest in the HFC space in the last couple of years. And so they have really updated their model, which is actually very similar to California's model. And they have put together estimates both for the state inventory tool module that I think very closely match, if not are identical to, kind of the national inventory set that EPA has kind of disaggregated down to a state level. So they're kind of two separate data sets, but tend to have very similar data. And so the plan is to essentially just utilize that data, which they have all the way back to 1990. And I'd have to look to be sure, but the couple values I've compared against the two are pretty close to what California had for their numbers as well. So I'm not expecting a very large change in there. And EPA's, I will say, they have also been working, they have kind of a per capita population based method as well, but then it sounds like from my reading about it that they then also use some kind of atmospheric measurements that they are currently working on, of improving, refining, but to adjust those values based on like ambient concentrations in different areas of the country. So I think they're going to be doing more work in that space, but it sounds like they kind of combine those two values to come up with a total estimated emission by state. And as I said, all the way back to 1990, which is very handy for our purposes. So that's kind of the plan for this sector, is just to kind of utilize that new method, that new data set, but really just because I'm not able to update the other one as I would need to. Sorry, that sounded really fast, but is there any
That's all good.
questions on that?
Any questions? Switch from California EPA. Okay.
Sorry, if you said this and I missed it, I apologize. But so are you just planning to use it going forward, or also redoing the historical so it aligns with the new tool?
It's going to be the historical as well. And yeah, it's nice because EPA does that every time they update theirs as well. They update it all the way back if they change their methodology to 1992. So yeah, that's the plan, because yes, we definitely want to keep it consistent, even though I think it's pretty close to California's numbers. It's good to be able to use the same method if we can.
Thanks, Colin.
Sure.
Any other questions about this switch? Okay.
All right. And then last one is the solid waste sector, or the solid waste subsector, and specifically the closed landfills piece of that. So currently, the inventory for the solid waste component of the waste sector uses data that's reported to the Air Quality and Climate Division, to their registration program. And that is based on kind of reported values of landfill gas that go through engines of the landfill gas to energy systems on the sites that are reporting. And so since Vermont has, well, only one active landfill right now, but also had another large one that closed, I'm not going to remember the year, but a handful of years ago now, I think 2021 or 2020 maybe. We still get reporting from them because their engines, I think were active in 2021 and have since been shut off for the closed one, but are still running for the open one. So the sector really relies on kind of those 4 facilities. And then what we had done previously, as you can see on the slide, is to just apply kind of a 15% adder for that. And that was based on kind of a discussion that my predecessor had about what percentage kind of all the other closed smaller landfills in the state would contribute. And it's a number that we've been meaning to update, but haven't really had a great way to update. But recently I received kind of an old workbook from the permitting section in air quality and climate that had at least some basic and not always complete, honestly, but information about a lot of closed landfills in the state. I think there are probably around 80 of them. And it's got basic information on kind of open date, closure date, and amount of waste estimated in place. And it was all kind of as part of, I think, the permitting process long ago that I don't really know anything about, but I think the data it's coarse and it's probably not super accurate, but I think it's way better than the 15% estimate that we have been using. So the idea is, and my colleague used to be my supervisor is helping me out with this now. But the idea is to take those landfills and that basic information and put them through an EPA tool called LandGem, which I list up there, to estimate emissions from the different landfills. The problem being that we don't really want to run this 80 different times. And so the idea was to kind of bucket, kind of a lump together different landfills that had similar kind of open and closure dates and similar amounts of time they were open, and essentially kind of run it as though it were, I think it was 5 or so large landfills, even though that wasn't actually the case, but it should be about right in terms of kind of the amount of waste generated and the curve for which that methane would be, the generation would be dropping off. So it's a relatively rough estimate, but we do feel like it's definitely an improvement on that 15% adder that we had been using. And I guess the last part of that would just be that we also had a few kind of notes in that workbook that spoke to whether or not the landfills had kind of an active flare during any point of their operation. And so where that was the case and where the gas was flared off, obviously we don't really want to include that in that kind of fugitive total that we're calculating. And so we ran, or my colleague Jeff ran, the few landfills that had those systems and kind of essentially took 50% of the emissions of what those landfills would have generated away. And that, again, is a pretty rough estimate, but we don't have any better data in terms of like the landfill capture rate for those flare systems and how long they were operated or anything like that. So the 50% is just kind of it's an educated guess, I guess, in terms of, we don't want to include all of it. We don't want to include none of it. So we kind of split it down the middle. So it's not perfect, but I think it's an improvement. So any questions on that one?
Is that all clear, folks? Okay.
All right. Well, my last slide is just questions.
Great. Thanks, Colin.
So yeah, I think that's about all I've got, unless anybody's got any questions on anything else inventory related or any of those kind of specific pieces I just talked about.
Thanks, Colin.
Thank you.
Nice. Okay. Deep in the weeds. That's what you guys are for in this
I
subcommittee.
really appreciate how clear and comprehensive and detailed that was. It's really good to have the transparency and information sharing about that, and the extra confidence that comes from hearing and seeing that. So thanks, Colin.
No problem. Thanks.
So the last thing you wanted to do was talk about liaisons to other subcommittees. And Jared and Colin, can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've discussed as a council, the steering committee of the council, is the value of having liaisons between the different subcommittees, especially as we go into the cap updating process and hearing what different committees are drafting or wrestling with. And so I think there's two questions. A, it would be great to get some updates from the folks who are current liaisons. And I saw Jay turned on his camera, which is great. Be good to hear from Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee. And we also have, I believe, Claire is our official liaison from Just Transitions. And then myself from Cross Sector Mitigation. I know that Leslie Ann, I believe, sometimes also contributes information from Rural Resilience and Adaptation. But I do want to just flag before we get into any liaison updates that I don't believe we currently have a liaison with the Agriculture and Ecosystems Subcommittee. And so I wanted to pause to see if there's anybody who is attending those meetings or is interested in doing so that could help play that role, if interested, and if not, we could ask them the same. I think historically there have been times when Ryan Patch has joined our meetings and he serves on that subcommittee, and I think there have been times when Colin has joined their subcommittee, but I don't think that that's a consistent ongoing thing. So no pressure, but if anybody is already going to those Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee meetings or is interested in doing so, it'd be good to know so that we can kind of get our full liaison complement filled in.
And as a heads up on those meetings, they've had one 1-hour meeting, and now they're having a 2-hour meeting next Thursday. And so they're just getting going.
Oh, so it sounds like great timing.
Yeah, they're just getting going, and because they have so many actions, strategies, and they have 150 plus actions and strategies in the initial cap. Their job is to really prioritize and try to lift up the most impactful strategies and actions.
And I see in the chat from Madison that you'd be happy to start attending those meetings. That would be great. And if you're comfortable with it, Madison, and if the subcommittee is comfortable with it, we can I can bring to the steering committee the recommendation around that kind of formal liaison relationship represented by you between our two subcommittees.
Thanks, Madison. Great. In terms of liaisons, are there other questions folks had about that? I mean, Jared, were you looking to solidify names for other subcommittees? What would be most helpful right now?
Yeah, I think there's two things. It's one, getting clarity on who the liaisons are, and then from those folks who have been attending other meetings, hear any relevant updates. So was the understanding that I had shared, did that match the folks named? Jay,
yeah, Jay, you jumped on camera.
Claire.
Yeah.
I just heard my ears are on fire here. Hello, everyone. Yeah, so at the May 10th meeting, Leslie Ann and I we were asked to give an update on the state of the science of climate projections, especially around extreme weather hazards. Recall again, my background's more weather, Leslie Ann's more climate. And we provided about a 20-minute overview presentation to the committee. General state of affairs for the committee at a really high level. There's a new cycle of people and a lot of spin up of knowledge and education. And it seems like focus could be a little better overall, just from a knowledge standpoint. We did our best to try to keep people on target. In that meeting as well, the hazard mitigation plan work was discussed at the state, just more knowledge sharing as well. And I haven't leaned in as much recently. I've actually just undergone a move out of state, and I now live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So, that's one thing to discuss my role here moving forward. I'd love to keep participating, but I don't know if that disallows me in any way.
Vermonter at heart, perhaps?
I was a Vermonter for 19 years. That's pretty good.
I don't know if we've encountered that question yet. That's an interesting one.
I think we encountered it from practical standpoints that people are spending a lot of time out of state. It was like in different time zones and things, it was challenging, but I'm not sure there's a rule.
Yeah.
Claire?
Well, I don't actually know if I was an officially designated liaison, but I am a staff support member for Just Transition. So through being a member of Science and Data and staffing Just Transitions, I do attend both meetings regularly. So I'm happy to report back. And I do the same for Just Transitions informally. I would say similar to rural resilience and adaptation, there's a lot of new members. In Just Transitions, there's only a handful of us, staff and members, who were around, I think, for the initial climate action plan. So Just Transitions actually has met pretty regularly since, like, all throughout, but I feel like this spring has done a bit of a step back to onboard new members, and then has been focusing in a couple different ways. One is regrounding in the subcommittee around the guiding principles for Just Transition, since again, not many of the members or staff were there when they were written. So there's been kind of an internal learning and digesting process, and that has aligned with, similar to our conversation, that a major role of Just Transitions will be having liaisons to each of the subcommittees, particularly the ones developing strategies, so that they can help kind of be the equity related kind of voice in the room and help with the application of those guiding principles from a practical standpoint. So Just Transitions actually is not meeting over the summer to allow those liaisons in particular some more flexibility to attend other subcommittee meetings. And then is actually having a couple like internal training sessions around how to apply the guiding principles. So hoping to be a good resource for other subcommittees looking to really embrace kind of that equity lens as we review and reprioritize. And then the other major focus related to our first conversation has been around, I think, public engagement and helping folks in the Climate Action Office with various aspects that have come up. There was a small public engagement task group that recently focused on developing guidance for how the subcommittees could handle public comment in a way that would be more meaningful and help kind of the voices that come to the table feel like they're being heard and that feedback is taking place. And so that was a discussion item at the last subcommittee meeting. And I think those recommendations will be considered at the Climate Council meeting on the 8th to be formally adopted. And that talks just, broadly about how subcommittees should think about planning for public comment in their meetings, how they should take in and respond to feedback and things like that. So Just Transitions won't meet again until I think at least August, if not September, but that's because they're kind of trying to be in other subcommittees. And I think the leadership of that subcommittee is going to do some strategic planning as well to think about how Just Transitions can continue to be effective going into the really meaty substance work of putting together the cap as well.
And I'm happy to offer from the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee. We've been developing the work plan for the subcommittee, which has been included identifying the task groups and the membership of those task groups, We're going to have, the same task groups that we had before in terms of topic area, transportation, thermal, electric, and non-energy in terms of the emitting sectors. And those task groups and the subcommittee as a whole are working to review the existing, like I imagine a lot of the other subcommittees in the Climate Council are doing right now, reviewing the existing recommendations in the initial climate action plan, and what progress was made or not towards those, and trying to identify which recommendations may remain as is, which new recommendations may be necessary or desired, which recommendations should be adapted, and then eventually looking to go through a prioritization process. So it's not just here's all the recommendations, but here's the highest priority ones called out for greater clarity as well. And that's just kind of the general process that subcommittee is going through at this point.
Great. Anything else about liaisons? Leslie Ann, sorry, you about to say something?
Not so much about liaisons, but maybe procedurally, and just hearing that there's so many new folks on board, and knowing that we are going to start racing really quickly towards that 1st of July 2025 date. If there's a mechanism or thinking behind maybe something for the steering committee to do a deep dive into how to get everybody up to the same place. In terms of content and knowing what's going on, what has gone on, so that you can bring all of these great new pieces of perspectives in looking at how to do the update to the plan without being sort of mired in how much stuff and how dense the first one was. So I just wanted to offer that as something to, particularly you, Jared, since you're on the steering committee still, just to do something to make it a little bit easier.
Yeah.
To really get to where we need to get to without being burned out.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great point. And I'll share that with the steering committee, and any other follow-on ideas from that would be really welcome. I think that I totally agree with what you're saying, that having some of that shared context and shared clarity is really important.
Thanks.
Breck?
Yeah, I guess I have a related question to Leslie Ann's, and it's specifically about the Science and Data Committee here. How are we, or are we going to be charged or requests made from the other subcommittees for data, science evaluation of data? What tasks are going to fall onto our table? Do we know those yet? And how will we know those?
Yeah, that's a great question, Breck. I'm happy to take a first attempt to respond to answer that, and then if folks want to add in, that would be great. I mean, our general sense and approach in the Science and Data Subcommittee has not been to develop or publish research or analysis on behalf of the committee. It's been more of a review role in a couple of different ways. So whenever there is a study that has been deemed as necessary, and the Climate Action Office has gone through a process to contract with an expert consultant, oftentimes the Science and Data Subcommittee or a subset of members of it who have expertise and interest in that area will serve as a review team to look at the request for proposals, the responses, the drafts, provide comments, so that there are, is that peer review component. So that has been a major one, and I think that's the clearest element of our work plan as a subcommittee going forward is the contracted analysis in support of the climate action plan that is related to or of interest to this subcommittee, the opportunity to have a role to review and provide feedback on that. I don't think there has been a situation where another subcommittee has asked the Science and Data Subcommittee to provide its own data. I mean, there have certainly been questions that have come, and I don't know if that's what you're asking. I'm probably not framing that correctly, but there have been questions where, or situations where folks have asked the question, what is the best available data on something that we could be used to inform our deliberations? And this actually came up with David and Colin and I as we were preparing for this agenda, wanting to be able to share clearly, both with this subcommittee and the others, some of the resources that either exist or will exist throughout the timeline of the update to the cap that we should all be aware of. So, one is the update to the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, which I will let Colin characterize the timeline around. But of course, that will be incredibly relevant to this cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, the other subcommittees in any recommendations. Because the inventory itself only goes through, only gets published through a year for which there's complete emissions estimates. But we know that there are sectors for which we have more recent estimates. So like the next inventory will go through 2021, but there'll be a number of sectors for which we have estimates going through 2023. EAN has taken the step to do some analysis around sector-specific emissions with the more recent data. And so we wanted to provide that, both the existing research paper that I put in the chat, and then we're planning to update that research in February once we have the new tax department data, both from the thermal sector and the transportation sector, which is about 2/3 of our, that data alone tells us the trajectory of 2/3 of the statewide emissions. And then, of course, there's the whole set of either existing or contracted analysis that I think members of other subcommittees can speak better to. There's the, work around municipal vulnerability, and some of the other reports. But I do think what we had proposed is, let's summarize what exists, what's in development, and what might be relevant to subcommittees that we could share with them. And then if they're identifying gaps, maybe we can work to help track down in more of like a lay of the land of where is really high quality data or analysis exist that people are seeking, rather than us producing something new, though. I don't think we had.
That's really helpful, Jared. Thank you. So my question, and I think it's echoed in the comment that I see from Claire as she's hopping off here, is, are we aware then of any proposals or projects that are in the pipeline that are things that we need to be aware of and thinking about dealing with? And so what is our work plan, to Claire's point?
Yeah. And I do think that now that we have more clarity on the timelines for a lot of that analysis that's being contracted for by the Agency of Natural Resources, that our next meeting would be a good time to go through that together. Sorry, Leslie Ann.
This is to add on to what Jared was talking about, and I think it's the part around the weather, climate, and climate change piece, and it's another piece that sits very squarely within science and data because it doesn't sit anywhere else, and it sort of grounds a lot of what it is we are doing or talking about or planning for in terms of climate and climate change. And last time around, Jay and I led that effort in terms of writing up those pieces, and we've already volunteered to have the updates that are coming down the pike or already on the pike in terms of how that sort of plays out. I think this is one of the places where the Vermont Climate Council differs a little bit from the Maine Climate Council, for example, which has a 20+ person body that looks at everything around science and data, and created a 100+ report just around everything at science and data for the state of Maine, that then became part of the documents that were key to putting together the climate action plan that Maine came up with the last time around. So right now they're in the process of kicking off their updates. And again, they have, this tremendous group of folks working in that space. And that's where there's a little bit of a difference. And I don't know if that's part of what you were thinking about when you asked that question, Breck. Like, where does all of the biodiversity and all of those conversations and writing come to play? in a central place?
It wasn't. It's a great question, Leslie Ann. But it was more about a process question of how will we obtain our tasks and our work plan and our workflow over the coming months to meet whatever objective we need to make by the end of this process.
Mm-hmm.
So I might suggest that
Those are good questions.
before our next meeting, maybe Colin and I as co-chairs and anybody who wants to join us can work with other staff from the Climate Action Office and try to identify co-chairs from other subcommittees to get a sense of the lay of the land of what exists and what are the needs around studies, analysis, et cetera, and what are the timelines around them, and just kind of present that in a clear table so that we can have that information to inform the beginning of getting to a work plan and timeline for our subcommittee over the next year. I feel like there's some of that basic background information that we just need to compile first, but then be able to share and identify any questions or gaps going forward. But would that be a helpful first step, Breck and
Yeah.
Leslie Ann, in terms of the questions you were posing?
Yeah, because we need to get those pieces in place from the get-go and not towards the end like we did last time, because everything else depends on that. And so we had a little bit of a mismatch in terms of which pieces were being cited from other places. So
yeah.
Okay. Right. It sounds like there's at least two pieces to this puzzle. One is what is being asked of science and data of you all, and what would be in the updated cap, like what you would have to climate action plan. And the other is how you are helping to shepherd out other data sources and get that out to the other subcommittees in the work. So those are sort of two different threads of this that would be, I think, very helpful to clarify.
Yes, thanks.
Okay. That's great. All right. Anything else that needs to be said on this? Like, I took some notes. Madison stepped up to do a liaison role for Ag and Eco. Jay and Leslie Ann have been doing that rural resilience. They provided a presentation. Claire is staff support for Just Transition, can be helpful with that. Cross sector, we got Jared and others participating. And then at least two things on the back end of this, with so many new folks on board, can the steering committee help think about a mechanism for bringing folks up to speed, both with like sort of the complexity of the initial cap, initial climate action plan, and then these other things like what Leslie Ann and Jay were presenting to the other group, right? Sort of the baseline information. And then this, where we ended up of sort of, let's have a clearer sort of flow of the things that are going to be asked of science and data, and then also the things that science and data can help push out to the other groups, the ones like Jared, you name them off. Yeah. How's that sound? Okay.
That's like a great summary. Thanks, David.
All right. So that was it for your agenda today. There's another sort of public comment moment here, so we can take a moment and do that. If anybody's been here that's not a member of the subcommittee that would be interested in providing some input on these issues, please feel free to chime in now. Maybe you all know everyone here. I think everyone's a member. Okay.
Great.
All right. So I think that's it in terms of your next steps. Do you have another meeting on the books right now?
No, I don't believe we do. I guess that would be another good thing to bring up, although I don't know that we're gonna come to a conclusion today, just because the last poll I sent out was not actually, there are more people here than I thought might be here today. But there was no time that worked well for everybody. In fact, pretty much every 2 hour span was missing at least, say, 4 or 5 people. So not sure what exactly to do about that. I can try to come up with if we're doing a recurring meeting, which seems probably like the way to go, we can go back to our kind of every other strategy like we were doing last time. But even that, I think, is going to be difficult to find something that's going to work for everybody. But I can either send out another poll and maybe ask that folks be a little more, I don't know, like just kind of cut and dry in terms of if you can make it at all, that's great. If you can prioritize it, that's great. But understand that that can't always happen. So I'm not sure what this best step is after this, but I don't know if others have thoughts on that.
In addition to the scheduling challenge, just like getting a sense of when and what you need to meet on, like it's clearly I think you would sooner rather than later want to think about this flow of what we were just talking about, what's being asked of you and how you can be most helpful in pushing out good information. Like that seems like a soonish kind of thing. Then maybe there's a gap in there. I don't know. Or if you all prefer to be kind of a steady Eddie, like let's meet every month or every other month. I just want to think about, what's really needed so folks don't feel like they're wasting their time.
Yeah. I would make 2 straw suggestions. One would be that we meet again in about a month towards the end of July to dig into the work planning in the flow conversation. And in the meantime, we can pull together the information to frame that up and have that be well informed, and then we can add to it. I do think that Colin has done like yeoman's work in terms of multiple scheduling polls, and I think it's a lot to ask of him. And I think it's, people are probably getting tired of responding to them. I think it's just the situation that there's no perfect time. And so rather than doing another one and getting the same results, that there's no perfect time, which I expect would happen, I think the best of no great solution is just to set up some recurring times that work for the most people. And if we can alternate, if there's 2 times that only don't work for 4 people, if we switch between them, if they're not the same 4 people, so that ideally everybody gets a chance to join at least, once every couple of months. But I feel like we should probably have, and we may not need each one over the summer, but I feel like it's probably smart to schedule a standing monthly meeting, potentially alternating between the 2 times that work for the most people. And who knows, we may not need the one in August, but I think that depends on what comes out of the July one. So that would be my straw suggestion.
The other thing too is we could shoot for 90-minute meetings as opposed to 2 hour. And maybe that sliding block of half an hour in either direction may be just enough to assist with the scheduling piece, because it's always on the hour, that, and people are blocked into that, then they feel like they can't even check that off. So there's that too.
Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to try to kind of schedule alternating recurring meetings. And yeah, if we think we can get through everything we need to get through, I can absolutely schedule them for 90 minutes, and we can plan agendas to fit accordingly.
Great.
All right.
Yeah, and historically the schedule changes, sometimes they've been necessitated by, academic schedules. And so I feel like if we can just use the existing calendar poll responses for our meeting times throughout the summer, but it may be something that's worth revisiting as we get closer to the fall. But hopefully the existing responses can work for the next couple of months.
Sounds good.
All right. So expect a meeting invite in about a month from now, and probably a strategy for going forward. Okay, great. Anything else thanks, Richard. Anything else before we finish up here? Okay.
Thanks, everybody. Great working with you. Thanks for stepping up, Madison.
Have a good weekend, everybody.
Yeah,
Bye.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Take
Yeah,
care,
take care.
everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Oh.